So, yeah, the ICISS concluded that these were the only two reasons, the only two cases in which humanitarian intervention would be considered legitimate. Because, of course, they were worried of people using the idea of humanitarian intervention to justify any kind of war. They said, no, only in these two cases would it be legitimate. And the UN General Assembly accepted that in 2005 as a legitimate basis for humanitarian intervention. So in 2011, the war in Libya that was conducted by NATO was very significant because it was the first war fought on the basis of this new R2P doctrine, responsibility to protect. So to give you, again, I'm not going to go into this in detail because I hope we'll do that more in the lessons, but very brief background to what happened in Libya in 2011. Just as in Sierra Leone in 2000, a violent rebellion broke out against the government. Now this was slightly confusing because it broke out at the same time as and under the cover of mass demonstrations against the government that were not violent, but within the demonstrations there were violent elements. Militias were there shooting at police and soldiers and so on. So there's an armed rebellion happening at the same time as these mass demonstrations had broken out. Now the difference, of course, with Sierra Leone is that this time the Western government supported the rebellion. They supported the insurgency. The West had never really liked Colonel Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya. He came to power by overthrowing a pro-British king in 1969 that Britain had kind of manoeuvred to put in place to keep Libya within the sort of informal British Empire that emerged after the British Empire. Now, Gaddafi was putting investment, tens of billions of dollars, into African financial institutions with the explicit aim of reducing the IMF's influence on the continent. He said Africa needs to be independent, we need to have our own. He in fact helped to create what's called the African Monetary Fund, obviously designed explicitly to replace the role of the International Monetary Fund. He was really seen as a threat to Western interests within Africa. And of course Libya is a very oil-rich state, so the idea that this fiercely independent, anti-IMF, anti-Western, basically was against Western influence in Africa, full stop. He opposed any Western military bases in Africa. He wanted Africa to free itself from the financial domination of Western institutions. And he was putting serious money, investing Libya's oil wealth into making this dream a reality. So he was not well liked by the West, seen as challenging their domination of Africa. And Western governments claimed that Gaddafi was committing massacres in the course of dealing with this rebellion. Now, the rebellion had actually been quite successful in the first few weeks, taking control of a number of cities. Then the Libyan army kind of got its act together and took those cities back. And it had taken back almost all of the cities with the exception of one, Benghazi. And the Libyan army was on the outskirts of Benghazi. And what the Western governments claimed was that Gaddafi's troops were going to go in and massacre everyone in Benghazi. There was a Guardian headline, I remember, saying 500,000 people are potentially going to be massacred by Gaddafi's troops, by the Libyan army. Now, at that point, then there was this huge fear, or at least there was the presentation that Gaddafi was about to commit this huge, unprecedented massacre of all the citizens of Benghazi. At that point, the UN Security Council authorized an intervention to take, quote, all necessary measures necessary to save civilian lives. That was passed because Russia and China actually abstained. They did not use their veto to block it. So that gave, in NATO's eyes, that legitimized a bombing campaign against Libya. They actually bombed the Libyan army for 7 months, completely destroyed it, until the government collapsed, and then Gaddafi was tortured and killed. Ever since then, and then again this is very important what's happened in Libya since 2011 when we come to look at the arguments against humanitarian intervention, ever since then the country's been in total chaos. It's been a war with itself basically ever since. The different militias that helped NATO to overthrow Gaddafi's government and kill Gaddafi subsequently went to war with one another. They've been fighting one another ever since. There's huge civil war in Libya right now. ISIS have been on the rise. Lots of terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, have set up training camps in Libya because it's got no functioning government to prevent that. There's been huge ethnic cleansing of the black Libyan population and African migrant population. A lot of these militias are openly openly racist. A whole town of up to 30,000 black Libyans has been completely ethnically cleansed by the forces supported by NATO. And there's been widespread torture, rape and killing of black Africans in illegal detention centres throughout Libya. So this intervention is, again in hindsight, many people argued was perhaps a mistake. It led to a complete breakdown of the fabric of Libyan society, an unprecedented wave of human rights abuses. Interestingly, in 2010, in Amnesty International's report on Libya, there weren't really many human rights abuses taking place. They did say there wasn't enough press freedom, and they said there was some historical cases of murders potentially by the state that had not been investigated, but there was no mention of any torture or anything like this. Now torture is absolutely widespread across prisons and detention facilities in Libya as a result of the so-called humanitarian intervention. Now that situation in Libya contrasts with Syria, of course, so there was this intervention in Libya. There hasn't been a humanitarian intervention as such in Syria. In Syria, it's a similar situation to Libya. At the same time, 2011, remember this in the context of, in 2011, this movement across the Arab world that was known as the Arab Spring, where there was lots of demonstrations and uprisings against governments that's seen as dictatorial or brutal governments. So you had that in Libya, you had that in Syria as well, and it soon became a violent rebellion, as in Libya, against the Syrian government, its leader, President Assad. And again, as in Libya, this rebellion was supported by the West, who helped train the rebels and arm them and give them training and propaganda techniques and so on. There are atrocities on both sides, but there are allegations made of particularly gruesome crimes made against the government, widespread torture, and killing of civilians and so on and so forth. Now President Obama at that time, President of US, said he would conduct a humanitarian intervention if the Syrian government used chemical weapons. He said this was his red line. If it was proven or believed that the Syrian government was actually using chemical weapons against its own people, they would have crossed the line, and he would authorize then a military intervention against the Syrian government for humanitarian reasons, a humanitarian intervention. Now in August 2013, there was a chemical weapons attack on a village just outside Damascus. US and British intelligence claimed they had proof that it had been fired from a government-held area. So they argued this was proof, or this was, let's say, overwhelming evidence that this was a government use of chemical weapons. So the stage was set for war. It seemed like the government had crossed this red line, and Obama would now have to live up to his word and conduct an intervention. What happened, however, Russia stood by Assad. They sent him, as this was happening, they sent him a new batch of really world-class, top-quality anti-aircraft missiles to defend his country if the West attacked. So it was clear this was not going to be like Libya. This would not be a pushover. Even Libya took them 7 months to overthrow the government. But in this case, there clearly would be US and British planes shot down. There would be Western soldiers killed. And in the end, the US and Britain backed down. And it now looks, 5 years later, that Assad and the government of Syria look set to actually defeat the rebellion and win the war. So in conclusion, let's conclude a couple of things. So humanitarian intervention increased in the 1990s as a result of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. First of all, what this did was the end of the Cold War increased the perceived need for intervention, because the end of the Cold War triggered instability in a number of states as the superpowers withdrew their backing for certain governments, leading to uprisings against these governments that were now seen by their own populations as weakened. And these uprisings then turned into civil wars in which atrocities were committed and so on. Yugoslavia and Rwanda are, of course, the most clear examples. Secondly, humanitarian intervention increased in the 1990s because it was made more possible by the end of the Cold War. There was a new anti-communist government that was less hostile to the West in place in Russia, and was therefore less likely to veto action at the UN, making action authorized by the UN Security Council more possible. And also, of course, Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was just weaker. It's more dependent on Western financial aid, less willing to rock the boat and oppose the West at the UN, and even if it was willing, it was less able to actually to actually prevent the West taking these kind of actions as it had been in the past. Now, I'm hoping that from this brief history, if you like, that you will have been able to discern a number of factors that seem to determine whether or not humanitarian intervention takes place in a particular scenario. So in fact, maybe pause the video at this time and think, if you can just, from what we said, consider and jot down 2 or 3 factors. What is it that means humanitarian intervention will take place in one case and not another? So just pause this and jot down your answers. My answers would be, I would say there's 3 main factors which determine whether or not an intervention takes place during a particular conflict. I'm assuming here, of course, that there are atrocities occurring. Okay, so but if there are atrocities occurring in a particular place, what is it that determines whether an intervention takes place? Well, firstly, I think it's clear from this history that intervention is more likely to take place when Western powers have other reasons for intervening as well beyond the humanitarian, such as resources, such as do they already support one side in a conflict, have an interest in helping one side win? Do they seek to overthrow a government for whatever reason? In all the cases of intervention we've looked at, the West had, in cases at least where the West intervened against a government, the West already had a pre-existing antipathy towards those governments because they were in some way resisting Western influence, and they were doing that not just within their own country but around the region. So Yugoslavia was resisting the IMF demands to privatize and so on. Libya was resisting not just within Libya but pushing this resistance out across Africa to Western military bases and Western financial manipulation of the continent and so on. So that's the first reason. Did Western powers have an additional motive for being involved in a conflict and taking sides in a conflict? In the Sierra Leone example, of course, the British feared for their investments in the diamond mines. They were allied to the Sierra Leonean government. They didn't want these rebels taking control of the diamond mines. So they had an active economic interest in crushing that rebellion. Second reason